Hello? The green button is on. Oh, now I hear it. Okay, everybody hear me okay? All right, so, yeah, my name is Adam Schulte. I'm with Artisanal Imports, and as Chad had mentioned, we don't really have a single brand. We have like 80 brands. So it's quite a challenge to be in this business, and I'm very, very proud of what we accomplish, even in this tremendous time of mass influx of craft breweries around the world, and even here in the United States. There's more and more beer out there, but we're still managing to be able to provide really, really top-end classic Belgian and other European beers to the masses. So I'm very excited about that, and I'm very excited to be here tonight doing the Beer Skull. It's a tremendous honor. So yeah, so that's me. I'm going to do something a little bit different tonight. I've never done this before. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got into the business, and also switch back to the beers back and forth, because I get a lot of questions as I'm traveling throughout the U.S. on, how do you get into this business? Have you guys ever asked that question to anybody in the beer business? You see this random guy walking into a bar with a couple of beer samples, and he's the king of the world and has all the friends, right? And how do you get into this business? I think the truth is it's actually a catch-22. You got to know people to get into the business, and you got to be in the business to know people. So there really is no way to do it. But I'll tell you my story because I think it's kind of fun, and we'll taste all these amazing beers. So we have 5 different beers tonight from a variety of breweries. I think, do we have the first one going out now? Okay, we're going to taste Trappe Witte, which is the only Trappist wit beer in the world, which is very cool. We're going to taste a couple lambic-based beers, which is really fun. A classic Belgian ale called Kwak is on the menu tonight. And we're going to finish with kind of an up-and-coming malt-based brewery, which, Daniel, I'm sure you're very excited about, right? Artisan Malt Bakery. So we got some cool things going on. So I'm going to start with my story. Hold on. First and foremost, I cannot believe this stuff actually works. This is not normal in the beer business for technology to actually work out. So yeah, here we go. I can control it with my phone. The beginning of me. So I was one of those obsessive compulsive kids that loved flavor. Whenever I tasted something amazing, I would tell my mom, "Mom, this is so amazing, macaroni and cheese," or whatever. So I was just like, for some reason, all this flavor that hit my palate was just like right to my brain and made me so excited. So I've always been passionate to talk about flavor and food. Everybody thought I was weird. So I mean, I grew up as a country boy, so I was able to be exposed to fresh vegetables, and we hunted for venison, and I walked down the road after it would rain and smell wet rocks and freshly mowed grass, those types of things. And I know now that when I taste beer, I remember a lot of these interesting flavors and aromas and things that were there when I was a kid. So I have a very I latch on to those memories as a childhood when I taste and drink beer. My first craft beer ever wasn't until maybe 18, 19 years old, and it was a Fat Tire in Portland, Washington State, and also a Moose Drool. So those are the 2 beers that really lit my palate up. I had no idea what I was tasting, of an intense bitterness, and totally opened up a world of things for me. I grew up in the country, so I was used to. Has anybody ever heard the term road tripping? Oh, yeah. You know what a road tripping is? Yeah, you know what road tripping is? We would drive around the gravel roads and drink Mickeys. That's what we would do. So miles after miles of miles in northern Iowa, that was my deal. So to taste these beers for the first time was really amazing. And after that, I started to seek out better beer. This was back in 2003, and I was living in Minneapolis, St. Paul, so there wasn't much beer to be had. Fat Tire New Belgium hadn't even entered the market yet, so it was really hard to find craft beer. You could maybe get some Newcastle or something. That's it. That's it. No, not even close. They didn't come in until about 2006 or 2007. But anyways, it was a dead zone, total dead zone. So I drank a little bit of these beers and started drinking wine and writing down what I was tasting. That was fun. I would take the labels off the bottles and put them in a book, and I'd write about what I had tasted and whatnot. And that kind of got me thinking more and more about flavor and aromas and all that kind of stuff. And it was just by happenstance one day I was walking by a liquor store, and I walked in, and they had a very, very small, one-door cooler that had maybe 10 beers in it, and the rest was wine. I picked up a bottle of Brasserie DuPont's Monet Blonde, and also a bottle of Hennepin Saison. And I took that back to my house, and I had a wine glass. I didn't have any beer glasses at the time, and I threw it in an ice bucket, and I went upstairs to my patio on the rooftop, and I drank this amazing Belgian beer. It literally blew my mind. I did not know what I was tasting, and I've been hooked ever since. It was a very, very, very memorable moment for me. My friends used to make fun of me and call me Decadence, because I'd always have a bucket with a Belgian beer and a wine glass. So that kind of kicked it off, and as I continued to get more and more interested in Belgian beer, at the time I was employed as a construction project manager. So here I am running projects for multinational home builders and starting to get into beer and wine and enjoying in dinners and stuff in my free time. I decided to sign up for this Belgian beer dinner. I went to this dinner and pretty much totally changed my life. I was fortunate enough to sit at the head table with the owner of the company, who would become my future boss. And from that point on, it was beer for 5 years. I researched everything I possibly could. I drank as many beers as I possibly could. And eventually, there's more to this story. Eventually, I quit my job and got into the beer business, but more to talk about when we get to that point. Does everybody have a beer? All right. I'm going to wait. I'm going to hold on the story until we talk about the beer first. It's going to go in sections. A little bit of story, a little bit of beer, a little bit of story, a little bit of beer. So that was the beginning. Okay. Anybody got any questions so far? No? All right. Okay, so we're going to start with the lightest of the bunch tonight. That is going to be Trappe Witte. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Trappist monasteries, what they are, why they're so important, and Trappe itself and how it's different from the other Trappists. First and foremost, a Trappist beer. To be a Trappist beer, there's 3 distinct rules that you need to qualify. Number 1 is the beer must be made by Trappist monks or under their direct supervision. Number 2 is the beer must be produced inside the walls of the monastery. Number 3 is a portion of the proceeds must go back to the charities that are directly operated by the monks themselves. So that is what you need to do to be a Trappist monastery. There are some beers out there that are Trappist style or Abbey style, but there's no monks behind the show, and they're certainly not giving their profits to charities. So that's a very, very important thing. Trappe was one of the original 6 monasteries, and other than you have Chimay, Orval, Westvletren, Westmalle, Rochefort. They all left France in the 1830s and established their monasteries in Belgium. 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, they were all leaving religious persecution in France. The monks that founded Trappe left France in about 1880, and they ended up settling in a small plot of land called the Koningshoven, or the King's Garden. That was just across the border of Belgium in the Netherlands, so they became the first Trappist monastery in the Netherlands. So that makes them very unique. They're Dutch, not Belgian. Since then, there's been a couple of Trappist monasteries that have started brewing beer in Austria, one more in the Netherlands, and there's even a new one here in the United States called Spencer. Have you guys heard of Spencer? That's a small Trappist monastery in Massachusetts, and Chimay helped them get up off the ground and produce some Trappist beer for the first time here in the U.S. There's a lot of Trappist monasteries around the U.S. doing a lot of different things, but they're making candles, they're making coffins, they're making chocolates, they're not making beer. Spencer was the first. Spencer Trappist, yep. So what makes Trappe unique is they make a variety of styles. They make 7 different beers that we get here in the U.S. They make 10 total. This is their wit beer, and it's not a traditional wit per se because Trappe is Dutch. They take a lot of their brewing techniques from both Belgium and Germany. Their original brewmaster actually went to Germany to learn how to brew. So with the Belgian Trappist, you have a lot of spices, you have a lot of fruits, you have a lot of intense aromas and flavors. The Trappe blends that a little bit with the clean, malt-driven flavors of the German brewing philosophy. So when you bring the two together, you have very clean, very flavorful, very delicious beers. The wit itself is a very unique part of this beer. It's not spiced. Most wit beers in Belgium are spiced, most of them with orange peel and coriander. This one has nothing. It's just very clean wheat. Definitely has the Trappe Witte, the Trappe yeast strain. If you taste other Trappe beers, you can pick up the similar flavor throughout it. But without the orange peel and coriander, I think it allows the beer to really shine through more and be more refreshing.
So it still obeys the Reinheitsgebot?
Not necessarily, no, because they do add some adjuncts like candy sugar. Most Belgian and Dutch breweries will add candy sugar. So it's influenced along the lines of being a very clean flavor. Oh, sure, yeah. His question was, do they follow the Reinheitsgebot, which is the German purity law, where you can only use malt, water, hops, and yeast. Most Belgian and Dutch are in that area. People that are brewing use adjunct sugar to amp up the alcohol and lighten the body of the beer. So it would not necessarily qualify for Reinheitsgebot. What do you guys think of the beer? Yeah, and I think they do say with this beer you can kind of, right between a German Hefeweizen and a Belgian Wit. And I think there's a little bit of banana that comes out of the beer, which is kind of that Hefeweizen. And there's just a touch of citrus that comes, and that's really from the hops. No spices at all. And what you're tasting tonight is from the bottle, and all of the Trappe's beers are bottle conditioned. Does everybody know what that means? So the yeast is fermenting the beer inside the bottle, and it gives it the natural carbonation. That's why you're getting such small bubbles, such refinement on the palate. It lifts all the flavors off the palate and wants you to, it's a very Moorish quality. It makes you want to drink more.
Is there anybody out there, anybody in the class that doesn't really like wits at all, that really likes this? Some people?
That's not uncommon. I've found that. I don't really like wits, and then they end up liking this beer. If it's not your style, it's not your style, but yeah.
Is that older than Hoegaarden?
I would say Hoegaarden was probably, I'm not sure the exact days of Hoegaarden, but I think that's more along the lines of like 1850s, 60s, because there was a lot of breweries brewing in Hoegaarden at the time. There's like 15 different breweries brewing in Hoegaarden, and Hoegaarden ended up being the only one left after that style was almost dead. That whole style was resurrected by Pierre Celis, and now we have all these delicious wit beers to thank for that. Cutting over to the second part of the story, after I had got some experience with drinking beer, I said I'd gone to this beer dinner, and that's really what changed my life. I sat at the head table. I was the last person to get a ticket for this beer dinner, and I was sitting at the head table with the presenter of the dinner himself, and he is now my boss. His name is Lanny Hoff, owner of Artisanal Imports. It was him and his wife and a distributor rep and his wife. And I sat there and was kind of the fifth wheel. And he would get up and present in between the dinner, and each course was paired with 2 Belgian beers, and one of the beers was used in the sauce on the dish, so you had to guess. So it was really fun. And the whole time he'd get up, I was talking to his wife about what they do and whatnot, and she said, "Oh, beer business." And I didn't know what an importer was. I didn't know what a distributor was. I didn't know what any of this stuff meant, so I'm just fascinated. So here I am, kind of at the tail end of my construction career. I'm pretty stressed out, working a lot of hours, and I'm like, I just said it to him as soon as he sat down. I go, "Man, how do you get into the beer business?" And he just rolled his eyes back. He's like, "Oh my God, man, you would not believe how many times." No?
Open that for us.
You got a sword?
I've opened a few other ones. I can't get a grip on it. You got it?
Yeah, you just need to break it.
You get it?
So he's just like, "Man, you have no idea." Like, he goes, "What do you do?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm a construction project manager." He's like, "How much money do you make?" And I told him, he's like, "No, man, you do not want to be in the beer business, trust me. Like, you got to start at the bottom, you got to work your way up, you're never going to get rich, blah, 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 blah." And I'm like, "Whatever, man, I just want to be happy." So it was really the next 4 years of my life. I followed him around, and he was doing all kinds of events at bars, and he was speaking at all kinds of places, pretty much doing what I'm doing right now. And I was just fascinated by all this happening around me. And he'd always buy me a beer when I came to visit him, and made fun of me, of course, because I was always mooching off his tab. But we became very, very good friends. And at that time, I decided to start making some changes in my own life. I started studying for the Cicerone exam. I said, listen, if I'm going to get in the beer business, what am I going to do here? I need some type of qualification. I don't have any qualification other than some sales experience as a shoe salesman when I was in high school at the mall, right? So I studied for the Cicerone program about 3 months or so, and I drove out to Denver, about a 2,000-mile drive, and took the test in 2010 at the Great American Beer Festival. And I passed. So this was a huge deal for me. I was the 175th person to pass that test. And then went immediately back and had my, my glorious moment of being able to tell people that, applying for jobs, like, oh, I'm a certified Cicerone. I know I can talk about beer. I know what I'm doing. I probably sounded like a total douche, but it worked in my favor. I was able to actually quit my job and get hired at a really, really cool wine and beer store, which kicks off the next part of my story. So, shall we taste some Kwak? Kwak. Let me change the slide here so we can talk about Kwak. Powell Kwak. So, Mr. Kwak. Powell Kwak was a real person. He owned a little inn or bar, I guess you could call it, in and around the late 1700s, just outside of Brussels in a small town called Dendermonde. His inn was situated right along a major mail route where all the stagecoaches were going to the next town over, and all these coaches would often stop and go into the inn and drink beer. Now, at the time, Napoleon was wreaking havoc and rewriting a lot of laws, and one of the laws that he wrote was that a coachman, on a stagecoach, there's two people, a coachman and a groom. The groom handles the horses, the coachman guides the coach. The coachman was not allowed to get off the coach and go into the inn and drink beer because there was a lot of coaches that were being robbed, the horses were running off, people were losing valuables, so that was the law of the land. So Powell Kwak, being an ingenious man, created some type of crude metal hook and some type of crudely blown glass, we have to understand this is back in the day, that would hang off the side of the coach so that the coachman could reach over and basically be served outside while he was sitting on his coach. So he would unhook it, he would drink his beer. Oh, yep. Ooh, yes, good one. He did, he invented the drive-through. So that was Powell Kwak. That's a very true story. And so the beer itself was not the way it is now back then. It's a totally different beer, of course. The brewery Bastille's, who makes this beer, they've lashed onto that story and recreated this beer in Kwak's name. So Powell Kwak was their original beer back in 1982 in its current form as it was released. And they created this wonderful marketing tool. This is the coachman's glass. So it would have been this. It would have been the history would be this top part here and some type of glass hanging off of it. And lo and behold, these carriages actually exist. I actually proposed to my wife on one while drinking a Kwak. So the beer will just dangle off, and when the carriage moves around, the beer doesn't really spill. It's actually pretty genius. But this handle and this base were added as bar-friendly vessels. It's got a little rounded bottom here, and keeps the glass from coming out when you're drinking it. So, you'll see a lot of people drink a Kwak like this. Over in Belgium, a lot of Belgians will drink a Kwak just like this. You can drink it while it's out, but you got to make sure you put it back in, or else it falls over and breaks all over the bar and makes everybody very mad. And this is really cool. At the top of the Kwak glass here, there's two things. It says "A votre santé" and "Apu Gesundheit," and that means "to your health." "Apu Gesundheit" in Flemish and "A votre santé" in French. And it's split down the middle because Belgium is Flemish at the top or in the north, and French in the south in Wallonia. So kind of a little throwback to the history of the country, and while you're drinking the beer, it's basically saying cheers to you, so it's very cool. Yeah, quick demonstration on how to pour Kwak. So the trick with Kwak is to not be afraid. When you pour out of the bottle, You want a 45-degree angle, and you want to fill the ball just before it hits the neck. Then what you're going to do is you're going to pour straight down, and you're going to get a big, tall neck of foam, and then the whole beer will just collapse on itself, kind of like how a Guinness collapses down the side of a glass. It's an absolutely spectacular presentation. So let's see if we can do this the Belgian way. Always facing the brand, table side. So we'll fill. And now, no fear. Now watch. And the beer just finishes itself off right perfectly. And it's so appetizing to watch. It's so, makes me want to just drink the whole thing. I'm actually a little shaky because I haven't eaten any food, so I should probably drink a little bit of Kwak because it's a very nourishing beer. It's a weird beer. It's 8.4% alcohol. There's no style for it. The Belgians just call it Belgian specialty. If you order a Kwak at a restaurant in Belgium, you want a Kwak, you want a triple Carmelite, you want a Chimay, you want a blonde or a brune or a Duvel. Like, that's really what you get. Like, Kwak and Carmelite are called out by name. They don't have a style. If you walked in and asked for, could I have an IPA, or could I have a Saison, and they just look at you like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So Kwak is really Kwak, but if you had to style it, I guess you could call it a Belgian amber. In a way, I guess. I don't even know what that means. What do you guys think of the beer? Yes, sir.
Did they develop that style after like the yards and half yards, or
It's tough to say.
did the British take it from that?
I really don't know, to be honest with you. There's a lot of brilliant marketing behind this whole thing, so I'm not sure who made it up first. But they've definitely, this is definitely a world-famous glass. Like, people that were traveling over to Belgium in the 80s and 90s, when they come back to the United States, like, man, I saw this glass. It was so cool, and it had this wooden thing, and it was so weird. And yeah, it was definitely Kwak, for sure. It's something called the Kwak effect. You see one of these go out in a bar, and all of a sudden you're gonna see 4 or 5 more go out because what's that? What's that? What's that? So.
I mean, would you say that this is kind of really like a kind of a Belgian double? Because that's kind of what it sort of.
It does have a similar flavor profile of that. Yeah, a little bit lighter in color, and maybe not like roasty or chocolatey like some doubles can be. Yeah, it's incredibly drinkable, and that's another thing. We call it the Kwak zone. One of these, and all of a sudden the next one it's going down real fast. All of a sudden 3 or 4 of them, man, you'll feel great. It's like one of those heightened buzzes. It's not like you're like, it's like, wow. So be wary of the Kwak zone, everybody.
Is it kind of like the Chimay Red?
I've never drank enough of those to really get into the zone. You had a question as well, yeah?
Do they fry carriages in Paris?
They do, actually, and the carriages that the brewery has, the grandfather of the brewery is actually a collector of old carriages. One of them came from a very famous French prince. So he's got these carriages that are from back in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. He's got like 8 or 9, 10 of them, whatever, right outside the brewery. And if you go to the brewery, you can visit and look at the carriages. And if you're lucky enough, you might even be able to ride one. Sometimes they do some rides. They're absolutely beautiful pieces of art. Yes?
This was particularly special yeast that they used to get. I know that's what gives it the edge of the flavor. Like, Google has its own yeast.
Yeah.
Chimay has certain yeast. Does Kwak have its own yeast?
Absolutely, yeah. Now, Bastille's is famous for 3 beers: Triple Carmelite, Kwak, and Deus. All 3 of them use different yeasts. Have you guys heard of Triple Carmelite before? They have it on draft here. One of the best triples ever produced. It's fantastic beer. They're very famous for that beer on its own, but arguably Bastille's might be more famous for Kwak. Now, Deus is a very special beer. That's a champagne beer, the first of its kind. Produced first in 2000. They actually brew the beer in Belgium, ship it to the Champagne caves of France, and they condition it just like a champagne in these Dom Perignon-style bottles. So they riddle and disgorge it over a period of a year, and then they freeze the neck, the yeast in the neck, and then the carbonation that has been formed in the bottle pushes the yeast out, and they sacrifice a 12th bottle to top off the previous 11, cap it, and send it over to us to enjoy. It's a very expensive beer, but it's very, very special. So all 3 beers that they make all use different yeasts, and all three they could not be more different, which is a testament to a brewery to be able to sell only 3 beers to the entire world and be very successful. Keep in mind, Bastille's brewery only sells 80,000 barrels of beer to the entire globe, and they might be in 60 countries. So most mid-sized craft breweries are bigger than this, and most of those breweries are making 10, 15, 20 different beers throughout the seasons. Bastille's makes only 3. That's why everything is so carefully considered: the marketing, the glassware, the flavor of the beer, the differentiation. Amazing, amazing brewery.
Hey, just so you guys know, I kind of made a deal with Adam before class that as long as he continues to supply us with the glassware, I'll keep the beer on. So you guys will be able to find it here full time. We don't have any on draft, which is a bummer. I intended to have it on draft, and the last one got swiped out before I could get it. But as soon as it's available back on draft, we'll have it here on draft. We'll be serving it in these glasses. As long as you guys don't steal them. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that this episode is being recorded, right? I'm just kidding.
Anyway, yeah, we are going to start, you guys after class, if you want to buy one, you can buy one. We have it in bottles, and we'll serve it in glass until we get the draft. But if you wanted to try one, I kind of want to drink it out of the cool little thing myself. But
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
just wanted to let you know.
All right, continuing on with the story. After I quit my construction job, I took a massive pay cut, and I got hired working at a very, very cool beer and wine store called the Ale Jail, the Wine Thief and the Ale Jail in St. Paul, Minnesota. This place was nothing. It was just a wine shop, and they had purchased the store next to it and asked me to build them a beer store from the ground up, and that's what I did. So we had 1,500 SKUs from all over the world, a whole wall of Belgian beer, 500 different American craft beers that you could mix a six-pack with. Just a spectacular beer store. And I was hand selling beer to all the neighborhood people. So I wanted to talk about beer. I wanted to tell the story about Belgians and what it was all about and why it was so special. And it was just an absolutely fantastic time. At that same time, I met Mr. Pat Fahey. Do you guys know who Pat Fahey is? This is cool, Chad. Listen to this. Pat Fahey is the youngest Master Cicerone to date. I met him at the Ale Jail. He walked in as a punk kid and would talk to me about beer, and we kind of hit it off. And at the end of the day, we ended up closing down the store and writing off some beers, and we would just taste beer for a couple hours after every shift. We learned a lot about beer. He was very interested. We became friends. And at that time, I need to credit Chad Jacobs for some of my success in this business, because right at that time when I met him, he goes, "Hey man, I go to school at WashU, and I go to Cicero's Beer School. It is so, so, so cool. This is what we do." He goes, "Maybe we should start something like that in Minneapolis, St. Paul." And I'm like, "Yeah, let's do it. I'll kind of co-brand it with the Ale Jail, and we'll teach a bunch of people about beer in an up-and-coming beer scene." So Pat reached out to Chad and probably Karen and said, "Hey, can we do this? Is it okay if we do this?" And they said yes. So we started our own beer school in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and had a ton of fun. Structured it pretty similar to the way that it's being done here, and we weren't nearly as professional or good at it, but that was kind of the start of my education of the masses, and really going out there and talking to people about beer. So very, very cool story how it connects back to here at Cicero's Beer School. 7 years later, here I am doing the real one. So, yay.
I remember when he contacted us.
Yeah.
And asked if it was okay if we emulate, what we're doing. And I don't know that he really was going to need permission exactly, but
Yeah.
he reached out, and we were like, yeah, of course, So.
Well, I'll say it's turned into a good success. The original beer school, as we called it, has now been absorbed by a guy that started a company called Better Beer Society, and he does beer school as a part of his business. He calls it Better Beer University, and the tradition is still going now. And he also does like draft tech and staff training on the side. So it's a very cool thing that little thing that we started before I left the Ale Jail is still going on. But now at this point, I left the Ale Jail and Wine Thief, and I was hired by my good friend Lanny Hoff, as we had built a good friendship over the year. I said, "Man, if I could ever work for you, please let me work for you. I love these beers. I love the whole import idea." He's like, "All right, let's do it, but you got to move to Chicago." I said, "Done." So that was 5 years ago in just a couple months. So I've been in Chicago ever since, and that's the next part of the story. So let's talk about the next beer. Everybody taste it yet?
It's still going around today.
What's that? The people that didn't get some, didn't get this beer? Just you?
Just me.
Whew. Very refreshing after a little bit of Kwak. Huh?
What was the alcohol on the back?
8.4%. So, Elgoods. Yeah, very, very interesting project. As an importer, we get to do a lot of cool things. One of them is finding little breweries in the countryside that kind of need to be reinvented and see if they want to get involved in a project. And that's exactly what happened here. So Elgoods is actually a very old, traditional, family-owned English brewery. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but nobody's really drinking a lot of English beer lately. It's really, really good. If you get a good pint of English cask ale, I mean, man, it's some of the best stuff out there, right? But it doesn't translate well to the American palate yet. So not a lot of English beer going on, and English beer is kind of slowing down even in the home country. So this brewery, Elgoods, the owner of the brewery, he has 3 daughters. They're all going off to school to be lawyers and doctors and what it might be, and no one wants to continue the brewery. So he's, after a couple hundred years, he's like, my daughters don't want to continue the brewery. We might have to close down. Like my 3.2% alcohol bitter isn't selling as well as it used to 100 years ago. So the owner of Artisanal Imports, he happened to be traveling through the countryside and had heard about this brewery, so he went there and talked to them. And as he was getting a tour of the brewery, he noticed that in the back corner, they had an old cool ship. He says, "What is that?" And of course, oh, that's the cool ship. We used to use it for, cooling down our beers. It wasn't the lambic. It was just that was their cooling method. They didn't have any modern cooling methods. So he goes, "We haven't used it since the early 80s. And he's like, "Well, I think we should consider using that thing. I think we can revive the brewery by, making a sour beer and having some fun." And it was just like, huge eyes. What? I'm not going to purposely infect my beer. We do everything we can not to infect the beer. That's crazy. So it took some convincing of the brewmaster, but here's what we did. There's a person in Belgium, his name is Roger. They call him the Sour Whisperer. He basically helps any brewery making a sour beer in Belgium, all the lambic brewers, anybody doing any type of wild fermentation, he helps them perfect their wild fermentation. So he's very well respected. We called Roger and said, "Roger, come over to Elgood's brewery. We want you to take a look at this brewery and see what we can do." So he walks through the brewery, and the brewery has this beautiful courtyard, and there's a big apple tree in the courtyard. And he sees the cool ship, and at the end of the walkthrough, he goes, "Listen, this is what I think we should do. Cut down that apple tree, cut it into slats, and install it above the cool ship. Then start brewing some beer. And as the steam rises up from the cool ship, it's going to soak into that wood, and it's going to start to create natural yeast cultures that are of the terroir, of the area of your brewery. And we're going to start fermenting some cool beers." So we did, and that was Elgood's Batch 1, and it blew everybody's minds. What they're calling it, the brewery is based out of Cambridge, so we're calling it Cambic, Cambridge Lambic style ale. And it's very difficult to ferment a batch of lambic and be, they probably had a couple of batches that went awry to begin with, but to release a product that's that good right away was very, very special, and we knew we had something special there. So kind of a fun little project as an importer to be able to do something like this. This happens to be the 4th batch that you're tasting now. Every single batch is slightly different. This one, I think, is very strawberry-ish on the fruitiness. Has a nice malty character on the back. It's very savory. Nice sharpness, but light on the palate. It's very drinkable, but has enough body to be interesting. And then they'll continue to make new batches. They have a sour stout coming out in the fall, which is like soy sauce, umami, bomb, chocolate stout. It's fantastic. So you're going to see some really cool stuff coming from Elgoods if you ever get a chance. It's a draft-only beer, so if you ever see it on draft, make sure you pick up a glass of it. They are the only sour brewery in England right now. Yeah, and the tradition goes back to the old porter brewing. They used to have sour porters. They would age them in these big barrels, and they would blend the old sour porter with a younger porter just to use that beer up so that it didn't go to waste. So they did have a little bit of a history with sour-ish brewing, but that was gone a long time ago, and this is really a revival, and it's really, really caught the attention of the masses. Yes, sir? Did you say briny? Briny. Yeah. Good question. I would say lactic acid, probably. That's my only, like salty brine water, to me relates to lactic acid, which has got kind of a subtle sharpness and clean, like.
A lot of those, like turbinates, like Linden's Creek or something like that, they don't have that.
Yeah.
They have much more sour, fruity flavor.
A lot of it could depend on the blending as well, because a lot of those lambics are blended down many, many times. Some of them are straight. This is straight up, no blending. And what you're going to taste next is also straight up and much more intense and sour. So we'll go on to the rest of the story here, and we can talk a little bit more about Elgoods as we get to the end. But everybody agree, very interesting beer, very delicious.
You guys all like this beer? Like, yeah? Not bad? Okay,
Okay, so getting towards the end of my story, I moved to Chicago, and I had no idea what the hell to do. Like, I'd never been a street rep before. Like, what do I do? The best advice I ever heard was, listen, man, just get in your car and go. Things are going to happen. And ever since then, you know, you're like, option anxiety. What do I do? There's so many people I can go see. There's so many people I can talk to about all these amazing beers, and you're all excited, and it's like, ugh. You just like shut down like a robot because option anxiety. He's like, just get in the car, go, start talking to people, things develop. That's exactly what I did, and managed to grow the market huge over a few years. We did 100% growth the first year, and 50% growth the second year, and 25% growth the third year. So the Chicago market just exploded with breweries and beers at that time, so I was very fortunate for that. And had some success, you know, creating special events and doing some cool things in Chicago, and they gave me a position to be national brand manager for two of our brands, which is Bastille's and La Trappe. They're our two biggest brands. So now I travel the entire country working with breweries and bars, and people on those specific breweries, and also manage a lot of the East Coast, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Boston, and Nashville, and just traveling all over the place, doing things like this for you guys, because that's what I love to do. Just this past September, I was knighted by the Belgian Brewers Guild, which is the Chevalerie du Fourquet de Brasseurs. That means the knighthood of the brewers' mash staff. And what that is kind of it's like the culmination of what I was, you know, really trying to do. Like, I spend my life promoting Belgian beer because I care about it. And the history is really important, and the flavors are very important to me. And the honorary knighthood is basically something that they bestow on the people that have spent their time and energy promoting Belgian beer around the world. So, you know, it might be a Japanese importer, it might be a guy from Russia that's a distributor, it might be someone like me that just goes around and tries to sell Belgian beer to people like Chad. So that was the end of it for me, and that's kind of my whole progression into this wonderful business that we call importing. So there's that. And lastly, Cuvée des Jacobins. Some people say Jacobins, but it is actually Jacobins or Jacobins if you were pronouncing it in the French way. This beer is brewed by a brewery called Omer Vandergenst, formerly called Bacor. And they've been brewing in the Flemish region of Belgium in West Flanders since the 1890s. 5 generations of family have run it. And they've always brewed a sour beer. You guys know what the word cool ship means, or why they call it cool ship? Anybody ever heard this story? Because it's a cooling vessel, and it kind of looks like a boat in a way. But the original cooling vessels were actually, this story was told to me by the owners of the brewery, they were hollowed out tree stumps, and they would brew the beer inside the tree stumps. So they were cool ships. That's kind of how the progression of the word became what it is, but that's a side story. Anyways, they've always made a sour beer called Vandergenst Oud Bruin. And in the 1930s, they installed a cool ship. So they built a tower that's 60 feet tall, 5 stories tall, and at the top of the tower, they installed the cool ship, and the ceiling at the top of the tower is concave. Does everybody know what a cool ship is, first and foremost? It's a copper basin some of them are as big as this room. And that holds the boiling hot wort that is steaming up and cooling down over the night. Shallow, about 2 feet deep this one is. So they have this cool ship 5 stories up in this tower. And when they pump up, the whole purpose was to pump up the beer and then use gravity to bring it down, because they only wanted to pump it once. This is back in the 30s before they had a lot of, pumps and electricity and that kind of stuff. So they were pumping it once, using gravity to spread the beer down to the tanks afterwards. They were making Pilsner in a cool ship, just using it to cool it down. The beer never got sour because it was consumed in the local region within 3 weeks. All the beer that was ever produced was consumed within 3 weeks, so it never got sour. It would have gotten sour. So that was in the 1930s, and then sometime in the 70s or 80s, they started brewing sour beer, lambic beer, with this cool ship. They stopped brewing the Pilsner up there and transferred it to a different part of the brewery to keep it from not getting infected. So they started brewing this beer, and they started blending it with some fruit juices and selling it as a, kind of a creek beer or a framboise beer to the local region. Well, we go and visit them in 2009, and we're walking through the brewery, and they want to sell us gallons upon gallons of Pilsner. And we're like, well, we don't really want to bring in Pilsner. Like, there's too many Pilsners in the market right now. We look over, and we see this little door that says Cool Ship. We're like, what is that? And they're like, well, it's kind of an old project. We're going to kill the whole thing. Don't worry about that. We're like, no, we got to see that. So we go up there, and they have this amazing Cool Ship just like sitting there. And again, another really cool thing about the import business, at that point in time, the owners of the company were able to say, listen, you have an amazing resource on your hands. You have to use this thing. And they started producing a stronger lambic beer. We had told them, don't sweeten it, make it as sour as hell, and we're going to ship it to the US, and people are going to love it. No, there's no way that's going to happen. Well, they did it. They called it Cuvee de Jacobins because it's the premier beer of their brewery. And now it's so successful here in the US that they've had to build a second brewery just to keep up with only sour beer. So that's one of the personal achievements that Artisanal Imports had with that brewery. It's a very cool story. But the beer itself is very unique because it's a lambic-based beer. Most Flemish reds are not lambic-based beers. Are you guys familiar with the term Flemish red? Style of beer from West Flanders. Rodenbach would be the classic example of the style. Everybody know Rodenbach? Okay, what Rodenbach does is they brew a brown beer, and they pitch the yeast. And that yeast is a mixture of lactobacillus, pediococcus, and Brettanomyces and Saccharomyces. It's a very precise mixture of that yeast. And that yeast goes into that brown beer, and it goes right into a big wooden vat, and it ferments out over a period of 12 to 18 months, and it becomes Rodenbach, or Rodenbach Grand Cru. That's the traditional Flemish red method. This brewery, being located not too far from Rodenbach, has created their base with spontaneously fermented lambic-style beer, lambic beer. And what that means is they send that wort up to the cool ship, and it sits overnight, and as the steam rises from that hot wort, remember I told you the ceiling of the vessel is concave? It pushes hot air out, and there's some vents down below that suck cold air in, so it creates convection, natural convection. And that cold air being sucked in drops all the wild microbes all over the beer, and it begins fermentation. Okay, so they let it chill for 2 nights, and then they send it across this little tube over across the street into the photo room, and they put it in big tanks, big wooden photos about as tall as this room here, about as wide as the set of chairs here, and it sits there for 2 years, and it ferments, comes out looking clear like a white wine, funky as all get out. And then what they do with this beer, rather than back sweetening it with sugars and stuff like that, they actually use this German malt, this darker German malt, kind of like the wort from that malt is blended into that straight lambic beer to create Cuvée de Jacobin Rouge. So a Flemish red that is 100% base lambic. Their other beer that they make called Vandergans Oud Bruin is 30% of that base lambic with a brown beer blended into it. So this is the Cuvée. It's very sharp. It's very sour. Yes, sir.
Is for the stuff with the yeast with spontaneous fermentation, it sounds like they were using this bullshit like the other guy used the oil to create these. Does that mean you could do that? I thought you only could do that stuff in like Belgium because it was regional. That
Yep.
wild sport.
It's a great question. His question is, can you make lambic beer in other areas? And the answer is absolutely yes. And you'll even get that answer from the Belgians themselves. There's a small area in Belgium where all these breweries still exist. It's called the Seine Valley. There's is this more Cuvee? Ooh, yeah. Double fisting. It's called the Seine Valley, and there's 5 or 6 or 7 lambic breweries there that are still making traditional lambic beer. Now, when Michael Jackson first discovered these breweries, they were the only ones left. So the idea of lambic only being produced in that little area became kind of solidified in people's minds when he wrote about it in his book, Traveling the World and Tasting Beer. The truth is, many, many breweries across Flanders brewed a lambic type of beer, spontaneous fermentation and whatnot, including Bacoor. So technically, I mean, there's no actual rule in Belgium that says this is lambic and that's it. It's not there yet. They fight over it all the time. But technically, this is a lambic beer as well. They say, hey, if you're an American and you have a lambic brewery, it's not going to be our lambic. It can be your lambic, and it can be good lambic, but it's not going to be our lambic. It'll be your lambic. So it's just different tastes. If you ever had Allagash beers, they make some fantastic, cool ship beers, and they're producing lambic beer.
So if I understand right, the secondary, a lot of lambics like this, the secondary fermentation is open with the wild yeast is from fruit yeast. This is from malt.
No, all lambic first primary fermentation is spontaneous and always malt-driven. They don't ferment the fruit for the first fermentation. They put the fruit in afterwards if it's a fruit lambic. But straight base lambic, it's a wheat and barley-based product, typically like 65% barley, 35% wheat. They used aged hops for certain for certain alpha acids that are in those hops, and they ferment it in wooden barrels over a period of 3 years. Old lambic, 3 years. Young lambic, 1 year, 2 years, and then oftentimes the beers that you get are blends of all 3 of these different beers. I think it's so fascinating to talk about the yeast and how it creates lambic because it shouldn't necessarily taste good. There's no reason why lambic beer should taste good, but we're somehow given this amazing product at the end of all this digestion from all these bacteria, and it's wonderful to drink because the first thing that happens in lambic brewing is Saccharomyces fermentation. That's the basic ale yeast strain, right? And they eat all the sugars so fast that they basically harbor or inhibit any other bacteria from growing because they're fermenting everything so fast and they're multiplying so fast, no other culture of bacteria can establish itself. And that produces the majority of the alcohol in a lambic, is the Saccharomyces. And they produce CO2 and alcohol as a byproduct. So when the Saccharomyces eats all the simple sugars, the next thing that comes in is lactobacillus. It ferments some of the compounds that the Saccharomyces has given off, and it gives the beer a little bit more alcohol and some lactic acid, which is the majority of the sourness you're tasting in this beer is from lactic acid. Once lactic acid gives off enough, or lactobacillus gives off enough lactic acid, it basically kills itself because there's too much pH. It kills itself and dies. At that point, Pediococcus is the next major strain that comes in and eats the byproducts of the lactobacillus. And when Pediococcus, I've seen this a couple times, when Pediococcus ferments a beer, it is the grossest thing you can possibly imagine. There's like a giant worm inside of it's just like, ugh. I mean, it's the worst. And when Pediococcus is fermenting, it gives off diacetyl and a little bit of acid, lactic acid. And diacetyl is the buttery compound, right? You don't want that at all. But what's amazing about this whole thing is that wormy thing that Pediococcus gives off, it has a name, I can't remember it, that is exactly the food that Brettanomyces needs to survive. The last thing that creates a good lambic is the Brett fermentation for a long period of time. That comes at the very end, after the lacto and the Saccharomyces and the Pediococcus have killed themselves. It consumes all of the byproducts that Pediococcus nastified in that beer, all the proteins, all the diacetyl. It consumes that and converts it into strawberry flavors and cherry flavors. All the cherry flavor that you're tasting in this beer comes from Brettanomyces consuming diacetyl and producing cherry notes, esters. Also at that same time, Brettanomyces, it gives off this huge, they call it pellicule. It's this like white blanket of foam at the top of the barrel, and that protects Brettanomyces from infection by Acetobacter, which will ruin any beer and create vinegar, pure vinegar. So it's a scientific wonder that's continuously protecting itself. And then at the very end, we get this. That's it. Yes.
What's the name of this one?
Cuvee de Jacobins. Sometimes you'll see Jacobins Rouge or Cuvée de Jacobins Rouge.
Yeah, he's not started talking about the last one yet.
I like it in a twisted sort of way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What kind of food would you pair this with?
You know, it's delicious with really rich red meats. You need really powerful food, so red meats with some sauce on it or something like that. And then, amazingly, salads with walnuts. If you get a big, flavorful salad with walnuts, bites right into it. It's great. Yeah. I'm sorry, I actually forgot about the last beer. 5 is the new 4, right? Let me move on here. How much time we got? So we're getting pretty much to the end, huh? Tell you what, we're going to skip this last side about me and go right to the full moon. Okay. Everybody has the full moon 12? This is the brewery that I'm almost most excited about in our portfolio right now because he's focusing his entire attention on malt. Everybody's worried about hops. Everybody's worried about sour beers. This guy, he's focused on making artisan malts. So BOM stands for Belgian Original Malt Bakery. Okay? His name is Bert Van Eck, and his pedigree is absolutely spectacular. Well-respected Belgian brewery. He was the brewmaster at Rodenbach. He was the brewmaster at Orval. He was the brewmaster at St. Bernardus and helped create the Apt 12 recipe. And he was the cellar master at Bone Lambic Brewery. So he has all these amazing breweries on his resume. And it was at Rodenbach where he learned how to bake malt because they used to bake their own malts until like the 1970s. And what he did now is he left traditional brewing and he started a malt bakery. And he bought a coffee roaster and he modified it to be a malt roaster. So every malt that is used in his beer, he makes himself in his little bakery. And while he's roasting his malts, he spices the malt with orange peel or coriander or sea salt or dried fruits, whatever it might be. And all of those aromas and flavors absorb into the malt themselves rather than spicing the wort as it's boiling and cooking. So you get these very deep, flavorful, interesting beers, all with his own specially created malts. So what you're drinking right now is his beer, Full Moon 12. When he was brewing at St. Bernardus, for a small period of time, they brewed westvletren for the monks at westvletren. Eventually, they had to take that back and brew it into the monastery where to be underneath the Trappist laws that we talked about earlier. But so he knew the recipe for Westy 12, and of course, Westy 12 is the beer that everybody wants so badly. So he's like, you know what, I'm going to create kind of a clone. It's going to be my own. I'm going to remember back the recipe, and I'm going to recreate the own malts, bake them myself, make a very rich, chocolatey quad, and then I'm going to cut up I'm going to chainsaw an oak barrel and soak the oak in the beer and kind of be somewhat oak-aged. That was his idea, and this is it, Full Moon 12. Very, very amazing brewing mind, and he's got a lot of really cool beers that'll be coming out for the next year, like 21 ingredient fruit beers and multi-fermentation blends of wild beer and an old Mesopotamian style beer that's brewed with compacted raisin cakes, just like absolutely crazy stuff. He's having a ton of fun, and I think Full Moon 12 is an absolutely spectacular beer, and won't be available for much longer, but we'll be back next October.